Every year, on the exact same night, a man knocks on my door 3 times, waits 11 seconds and walks away. I have never opened it. My father never opened it either, and neither did his father before him. By the end of this video, you'll understand why 3 generations of men in my family have stood on the other side of a locked door listening to those knocks, too afraid to look and too afraid not to listen. My name doesn't matter for this story, but the town does. I grew up outside Willow Creek, Missouri, a stretch of gravel roads and soybean fields, about 40 minutes south of Springfield. My family has owned the same farmhouse on Route 9 since 1961, when my great-grandfather bought it from a man who sold it fast, for less than it was worth, and left the state without much explanation. Nobody in my family thought much of that until later. The house itself is unremarkable. White clapboard siding, a wraparound porch that needs repainting every few years, 2 stories, a root cellar my mother used for canning tomatoes. If you drove past it, you wouldn't look twice. That's part of what makes this hard to explain to people. Nothing about the place looks like it should hold a secret. The knocking happens every year on October the 9th. Always that date. Never a day off. Regardless of what day of the week it falls on. It happens at exactly 11:47 at night. My father used to check his watch when I was a kid, not because he needed to, but because some part of him needed proof that the world was still following its normal rules, even while something abnormal was happening 10 feet away from where we sat. I first heard it when I was 7 years old. My father woke me up around 11:30 that night, which was strange enough on its own, because he wasn't a man who did anything without a reason. He sat on the edge of my bed and told me, in a voice that was calm, but tight around the edges, that something was going to happen soon, and that I needed to stay in my room, no matter what I heard. He said if anyone knocked, I was not to go near the door, not to look out the window, and not to answer, even if the voice sounded like someone I knew. I remember asking him who was coming. He said, somebody who isn't allowed in anymore. That was the whole explanation I got that year. At 11:47, I heard it. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, not rushed, not angry, just deliberate. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. Then 11 seconds of nothing, which felt a lot longer than 11 seconds when you're 7 years old lying still under a quilt, staring at a door that suddenly feels thinner than it did that afternoon. Then footsteps walking off the porch, down the steps, and across the gravel toward the road. I counted the steps once I was older. 14 steps to the end of our driveway. Always 14. For the first few years, I thought it might be a neighbor playing a joke, or maybe a relative. None of us liked showing up drunk on the same night out of habit. Willow Creek isn't a big town. People know each other's business, and strange behavior tends to get explained pretty quickly, one way or another. But nobody in town ever mentioned seeing a man walking Route 9 that late on October 9th. Nobody ever claimed the knocking. And when I finally worked up the nerve to ask my father who he thought it was, he told me something that changed how I understood our house entirely. He said the knocking started the year after my great-grandfather bought the property, back in 1962, and it had happened every single year since then, without exception, for over 60 years by the time he told me. He said the previous owner, the one who sold the house so quickly and left the state, warned my great-grandfather about it before the sale closed, told him there was a night every year when someone would come to the door and that no one, under any circumstances, was supposed to let him in. My great-grandfather thought it was a scare tactic to justify the low price. He found out otherwise on October 9th, 1962. According to what got passed down through the family, my great-grandfather was alone in the house that first year. My great-grandmother had taken their kids to visit her sister in Joplin for the week. Around 11 at night, he heard someone approaching the porch, and by the time the knocking started, he'd already decided it was probably a farmhand or a lost traveler needing directions. He opened the door. Nobody was there. Not on the porch, not on the steps, not on the driveway. But the air, he said, felt wrong in a way he never found the words to explain properly, even years later. Cold in a way that didn't match the temperature. He said it was like standing next to an open freezer, except there was no freezer, no wind, nothing you could point to and say, "That's the source of this feeling." That night, after he opened the door and shut it again, something changed in the house. He started hearing footsteps upstairs when no one was up there. He started finding the root cellar door open in the mornings, even though he was certain he'd locked it. Small things. Nothing that would sound impressive if you told it to a stranger over coffee, but the kind of small things that build on top of each other until a grown man starts sleeping with a shotgun leaned against his nightstand. It didn't stop until the following October 9th, when the knocking came again. 3 knocks, 11 seconds, footsteps walking away. He didn't open the door that time. The strange occurrences in the house stopped within a week. That was when he understood the rule the previous owner had tried to warn him about. The knock isn't a threat if you leave it alone. It only becomes a problem if you answer it. So that became the tradition. If you can call something that terrifying a tradition. Every October 9th, whoever lives in that house sits up and waits for 11:47, and they let the knocking happen, and they let the footsteps walk away, and they do not, under any circumstances, open that door. I want to pause here and tell you that for years, I genuinely believed that was the whole story. A strange, sad little family ritual, passed down like an heirloom nobody wanted, but manageable, as long as you followed the one rule. I grew up, moved to Springfield for college, came home on weekends. I figured maybe some year I'd inherit the house and the ritual right along with it, and that would be that. Then, in October of 2019, my father broke the rule. And what happened after is the part of this story I still have trouble putting into words. My father was 61 that year. My mother had passed 2 years earlier, and he'd been living alone in the farmhouse since, which worried me, though he insisted he was fine. I called him most nights, and on October 9th, I called around 10 to check in, like I always did. He sounded normal. Tired, maybe, but normal. He told me not to worry, that he'd sit up like always, and that he'd call me in the morning. He never called. I drove out to the house around noon the next day after he didn't pick up 3 times in a row. His truck was still in the driveway. The porch light was still on, even though it was daytime. I found him sitting in his armchair in the living room, awake, alive, but not right. He wasn't responding to me the way he should have. He was staring at the front door like it might move. It took me almost 20 minutes to get him to speak. When he finally did, what he told me was this. Around 11:40 that night, he'd been sitting in his chair like he always did, watching the clock waiting for the knocking to start and pass like it always had. But at 11:44, 3 minutes early, he heard something different. Not a knock, a voice, calling his name from just outside the door. Not the family name we all share, his name, specifically, first and middle. He said it sounded like my mother. I need you to understand what that means for a second. My mother had been gone 2 years. My father, a man who had spent nearly 40 years respecting this rule without question, heard the voice of his dead wife calling to him through a door at 11:44 at night, 3 minutes ahead of schedule. On the one night, a year something was supposed to be standing on that porch. He opened the door. There was nothing there. No porch, no steps, no gravel driveway stretching toward Route 9 in the moonlight, just in the way it should have looked. He said the doorway opened under darkness that didn't match the outside at all. A kind of blackness that had depth to it, like standing at the mouth of a cave instead of a farmhouse porch. And from somewhere inside that darkness, he heard footsteps starting toward him. Not walking away this time, walking closer. He said he doesn't remember shutting the door. He only remembers being in his chair afterward, and it being morning, and me shaking his shoulder, asking if he was okay. For the rest of that month, the house was different. Not dramatically, not in a way you could film or prove to anyone, but different. Doors that stuck when they'd never stuck before. A cold spot in the upstairs hallway that lingered no matter how high we turned the heat. My father stopped sleeping in the bedroom he'd shared with my mother and started sleeping on the living room couch instead, closer to the door, like some part of him needed to keep watch. I moved back into the house that winter, partly to help him, partly because I didn't like the idea of him being alone in it anymore. And that's when I started noticing the numbers. Every year, the knocking happens later in the evening, or so I'd always assumed, since 11:47 had been consistent as long as I could remember. But once I started paying closer attention, comparing old journal entries my grandfather had kept, I realized the time had been slowly creeping earlier for decades. 12:03 in the 60s, 11:58 in the 80s, 11:51 by the time I was a teenager. Now, 11:47. And the year my father answered, it came at 11:44, 3 full minutes ahead of where it should have been. Whatever it isn't just repeating the same moment every year. It's getting closer. I didn't want to believe that at first. I told myself I was reading patterns into random variation, the way people do with anything unexplained, looking for shape and noise because shapelessness is harder to live with. But then, October 9th, 2020 came, and I sat in that same living room, in my father's old chair, waiting the way he used to wait, and the knocking came at 11:41. 6 minutes early from where it had started with me as a kid. And this time, when the footsteps walked away afterward, I counted them out of habit, the way I always had. There were only 12, not 14. Whatever is walking away from that porch every year is getting closer to the house, 1 October at a time, taking fewer steps to reach whatever it's aiming for. I haven't told my father about the missing steps. I don't think I can. He's better now, mostly, though he still won't sleep upstairs, and he still flinches at doors closing too firmly. But I think about those 2 missing steps almost every day. I think about what happens when the count reaches 0. I think about a night Maybe not far off now, when there won't be a walk away from the porch at all. When the knocking will simply stop happening on the other side of the door. Because whatever does the knocking will already be standing where the door used to be. I still live in that house. I inherited the responsibility along with the address. The way my father did before me, and his father before him. Every October 9th, I sit in that chair, and I wait. And when the knocking comes, 3 knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate, I stay perfectly still and I let it pass. I've learned not to check the clock anymore. I don't want to know exactly how much earlier it comes each year. Some kinds of knowledge only make the waiting harder. What I've come to understand, sitting alone in that house, night after night for years now, is that fear like this isn't really about the thing on the other side of the door. It's about what we're willing to risk to reach the people we've lost, and what happens to the people who come after us when we make that choice for them without asking. My father opened that door because for one moment, grief was louder than warning. I understand that completely. I might do the same thing myself someday, if the voice that calls to me sounds enough like someone I loved. That's the part of this story that scares me more than the knocking ever has. Not the stranger on the porch, but the possibility that any of us, given the right voice at the right moment, might choose to let it in. So, the door stays shut. The knocking comes a little earlier every year, and somewhere out on Route 9, past the edge of my porch light, something is walking a little less distance each October, closer to a house it has been trying to reach for over 60 years. If you've ever had something in your life that came back on a schedule you couldn't explain, a feeling, a sound, a visitor that always arrived on the same night no matter how many years passed, I want to hear about it. Tell me what night it was, and tell me if you ever found out what it wanted. I'll be reading every one of them, probably later than I should, probably with the porch light on.